mess with the antenna.
You have Skylink out there?
No, I'm kidding. Some of the folks do. But we saw our first black bear this morning in the yard.
Oh,
Oh, so where
wow.
are you? What mountains are you in?
Well, I'm in Montana, so
Oh, hi. We're in Montana.
in just on southern edge of Bozeman.
Okay, so I had good friends who were from Montana, and they now live in Walla Walla, where I was 2 days ago. But
Here, I'll show you.
they lived in Polson.
Oh, okay, here. This is Bozeman.
Yeah,
Yeah, big sky.
I know Walla Walla. It's
yeah. It's a nice community.
yeah. They're famous for their wine and their onions.
Exactly. They're sweet onions and they're really big red wines.
Yeah.
Well, so Andrew, I'm pretty excited to have you on here. Andrew and I, Carmen, are working on remember when we were working on RISE, Research and Innovation at
Oh,
the
yes,
Scientific
of
Edge?
course.
So I took that to Andrew in conversations with him, and we are creating something specifically about human potential called MindRISE.
Mind rise?
MindRISE,
Yeah.
specifically for healing trauma to support people with neurodivergence and autism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about human potential, but particularly in that space. And so we're just starting we don't even have to talk about it here, but like that's how I know Andrew
Okay,
as this
very cool.
collaborator.
And how does Andrew come to be interested in these topics?
That's a good
Oh, yes.
question. Andrew, you want to
Well,
introduce yourself?
That's a
also,
way of introduction, right?
yeah. Well, specifically the autism neurodivergent space, my 10-year-old boy has
Mm.
autism. And so that's principally why we moved actually out here to Bozeman. They have an extraordinary school here called the Cottonwood Day School for kids that are autistic and neurodivergent. So for the last 10 years, we have been deep into that space. I mean, I was aware of that space before, but we have been deep in that space. And through the work that I do at the Dawn Collective, we do very next level trauma healing work. And for the last 2.5 years, we've focused on working with the special operations community in the US and the special forces and SAS in the UK. And
Mm-hmm.
so we also have, and the first responder communities in the United States. So one of the things we've learned is that autism and neurodivergence is a really important element of the work with all of them. And through our work and our research and our studies, we've also come to confirm what I suspected is that the neurophysiological mechanism of action behind all of these things, trauma, autism, neurodivergence, is quite similar. It expresses itself in a bunch of different ways. And so
Mm-hmm.
the way that we heal ourselves and recruit more capacity is very similar in all these spaces.
Yeah. So that's, you could see why Andrew and I would get along.
Yes, of course. Of course.
Yeah. So what are, Andrew, we generally just sort of start talking, we don't know what we're going to talk about. So I'm wondering, I guess the thing that's on my mind is what are you passionate about like right now in your heart?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you a good story. I sent it to Julia this morning.
I haven't looked at my emails, so this will be fresh for me.
We got this extraordinary note from Kajani's teachers.
Mm.
And it's hard to describe how luminous and amazing it is to get a note like that from his teachers about how extraordinary he's doing. And not only how extraordinary he's doing, but what a gift he is to the whole school because he has massive, huge energy. And as Julia has not met him, but she kind of has a sense about him. And he's quite unique in the community in the sense that both his hemispheres are on
Oh,
rocket drive
wow.
all the time. And so, as a consequence of that, where we've been has been intense, to say the least, and very difficult. and been kicked out of school since he was 3 years old. And no one's been able to work with his wild tiger in the jungle energy. And so this school is just doing such a remarkable thing with him. And so one of the things that's really closest to my heart is when I see what he's receiving and what could have been had we not had the resources and just the stamina and the drive and the good
Right.
fortune to make ourselves here, just to pick up our family and move from point A to point B in 2 months' time and throw everything into pure chaos so we could have this opportunity. That to me seems mandatory as an opportunity for every child in this country. I mean, not only in this country, but in the world.
Right.
If we were to be able to provide this level of full, whole neurophysiological training and space and support to all of our children, then it would transform this nation, and more importantly, to my view, than anything else that we have, and it would make obsolete so many of these other problems that we're
Yeah.
sort of like tinkering with and fighting over and all that absurdity. But the one thing that is unifying, I think, to almost all Americans is bringing the full potential out of all of our children, right? And the other thing that's unifying is that for so many families, the amount that we suffer because we know in our hearts that our children are not getting what they need. And every family suffers in the same way when that happens. So that's really powerful for me. And then the other thing is that I have come to understand over years of doing the work that underlying so much of this chaos and this madness is trauma, and that trauma can be healed in very straightforward, systematic, future-oriented ways.
Hmm.
And that there's just so many layers and layers of confusion around it and how people are working with it. And then the whole labeling of it as a disorder is a massive problem for people.
Right.
And so being able to elevate the trauma conversation out of that whole morass and into something that is fundamentally workable. And I think that's what I'm excited about. And also in working with Julia is like taking these things that seem so difficult and just, it's not so much even about generating solutions. It's just making problems workable to ordinary people by simplifying them down to their mechanism of action. And that's what we always say about trauma healing is that trauma expresses itself in an infinity of symptoms, but the mechanism of action by which it works is more or less the same in every single human body. So if we can just focus our attention on the right way to train through our body, and that's why we call it training. We don't call it therapy. We don't even really call it healing. We call it training. Because if we can recruit the capacity, then we can restore the flow of information in our body and rewire ourselves. That's what Kaijani's doing, right?
Right.
But how do you, I mean, how do you do that? I like, like, I'm so excited that you want to talk about this because I mean, the people who listen to our podcast, a lot of people from the intelligence community, and then some people from other communities, some military, and some people from sort of that idea, the thinker community. And that's kind of it. And so these are people who are all dealing all the time, not only with their own trauma, but the trauma the country has gone through, even with COVID, even that is like a kind of a trauma we've all gone through. And then there's more severe traumas, or I hate this idea of ranking traumas because so many things can. Anyway, so I just all these ideas come out of me as to like how do you deal with the sort of tendency to for people to say my trauma is more legitimate than your trauma, it deserves more resources. And I'm sure that comes up with you because I think in the Dom collective, you're dealing with all of that, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great
Well,
question.
I just want to say, if it looks
Yeah.
like I'm looking down, it is because I'm trying to find a note that is relevant to what you said. And so I'm listening, but I'm also
Oh, hey,
desperately trying to find a note.
I am the master of, I think my limit of multitasking, and my wife would confirm to this, is probably five things at once. So So you are more than welcome
Yeah, the,
to do your
please
thing.
continue.
Um, yeah, no, that's a great question, Julia. Well, first of all, if we can if we can reframe, first thing is reframing things. Like when there's tons of confusion about something that is endemic, then we know that the framing is likely wrong, right? That's just like 101 using logic, right? What's the simplest possible explanation here? And so obviously there are not different grades of trauma, right? I mean, and so when we reframe it as not as a disorder and not as a psychological thing and not as a mental illness, because one of the things that I like to talk about all the time is if the words that we're using to describe something don't make the action that proceeds from those words concrete, repeatable, doable, understandable, then we have to reject that language. So what am I supposed to do with mental illness?
Right.
Like
Right.
I don't even know what mental means, right? And what is illness? A cold, cancer, right? It's an impossible thing in that linguistic reality to know what to do. So we have to reject that language out of hand. And I have a test whenever I'm working with people. If you present a word, if I present a word, if someone presents a word and I ask 10 people what that word means and I get 10 different answers, then that word does not meet the criteria of concreteness. Now, you may not understand how to do it, but when I say take the wrench and turn the wrench 5 millimeters to the right, or in the way that we train, when I say stand as if you're holding a 50-pound barrel in like the Yiquan standing meditation practice that we do, versus 99% of the other people that say connect your heaven energy to your earth energy, right? Like,
What?
how am I supposed to do that, right? And then everyone makes up some story that they're some enlightened being connecting their heaven energy to their earth energy, right? But everybody can go and pick up a 50-pound barrel and put their body in the anatomical position that is required by picking up a 50-pound barrel. And if you forget, go grab another barrel, right? So that's the key to all of this. And so trauma is an injury to the neurophysiology. And it's like a broken leg. And we spend so much time trying to understand why and when and the circumstances around which it occurred. But when someone breaks their leg, we don't really do that. We sort of talk about, okay, what happened? Okay, I fell off a ladder. Okay, great. But then you get an x-ray and they look at your leg, and then there's a very proven protocol for healing your leg, right? You isolate it for this much time, you use it after this point, you can analyze and assess when it's healed. It's not amorphous and abstract. Now, everyone's going to heal a little bit differently, and certain changes to diet and whatever will probably help. But ultimately, it's an injury to the body. And so, is a one broken leg more severe than another broken leg? I guess to some degree, right? You can have like a
Right.
compound fracture, but really, I've worked with men and women who've been exposed to, and I'm sure this is the same in the intelligence services, unbelievable violence. And yet, for some reason, the impact on them can be less than someone who was exposed to something that on paper would appear to be much more benign, right? But the reality is there's no way to predict how the human body is going to respond to an experience. And then you have a host of epigenetic factors that just come from our bloodlines and from our histories that contribute to the way in which we express being exposed to trauma, right? So that stuff is all nonsense. What's more important is just creating the conditions by which people have the right space to recruit the capacity so they can rewire themselves and move from that state of incoherency that trauma creates to coherency and get their threat detection systems working more coherently. And then you can prove that it's working because people will undeniably express more joy, more happiness, and all that good stuff, but also from like a military intelligence perspective, your pattern recognition is higher now.
Yes, right,
Your, right? Your capacity for anti-fragility is higher now.
right.
Your ability to recover is higher now. Your ability to build solidarity and trust and to anticipate situations is higher. And then ultimately, your ability to influence situations without necessarily even being there begins to come back online because you can now project your energy and your will into spaces, right? And all
Mm.
of that gets undermined and disrupted with trauma. So that's how we just keep it simple. It's like mathematics
Yeah.
in a kind of like a physics way.
So it's like you know what the splint is or the cast to put on the broken leg, and you put on the splint or the cast, and then the leg is over time, the leg is healed. The body heals itself. Does that continue to be a good metaphor for what you're doing?
I think that's a great question. Actually, as you say that, I would say a more appropriate metaphor might be injection therapy, like working with PRP or stem cell,
Um,
Mm.
in which I think this is actually really a cool analysis now that I just think of it. Because with injection therapy, you introduce a, a further injury to the body
hmm,
to a certain degree that catalyzes a healing moment in usually in a ligament or tendon that otherwise would not receive blood flow and oxygen.
hmm,
So by stimulating that quote unquote injury, you kick in place the body's ability to heal itself. And the best part about injection therapy is, and then you are asked to move, to work out, to train. So you're not like chilling. You get to actively do stuff. And I would say that that's the way that we do it. We train it. And we work with something very profound, I think, called renormalization group theory out of physics. And I think I know that folks in the military community and intelligence community dig this because what it speaks to is very concrete. And when it looks at there is a precise way to apply pressure to any system to get it to renormalize, to expand into higher potential. And the trick is the expertise and the mastery is to be able to apply that precise amount of pressure on the system, like Goldilocks, not too much, not too little. And then who's ever working with folks has to be able to take people to their edge and then gently move it back. And too often, what you see is that you have an extreme on one side or the other. You're like pushing people way over their edge. That's the special ops training. Way override your bodily sensation, your bodily, right? Which I guess when you're in your early 20s, there's a function to that. But then the downside is decreased performance rather quickly. And then not too little is really soft. And I think we all know from recruitment, if there's not enough pressure on a system, you won't recruit anything. You're not going to build muscle sitting on the couch watching Arnold Schwarzenegger work out. Like you're going to have to get in and do it yourself. So that's really the key, I think, to what our work is about. And anyone that I have seen that's really good at whatever they do, they're able to work that almost impossible balance between just enough pressure on the system to keep it in a state of constant recruitment.
Okay, now you've reminded me of a third thing.
all right.
So my favorite statement about leadership was by Ron Heifetz, who teaches at Harvard.
Hmm.
And it's a quite a clever phrase. And he says, being an effective leader is disappointing your followers at a rate they can tolerate, which is exactly what you just said, right?
That's so good. That is like
Isn't
the
it good?
story of my life.
It it uh, it really captures that tension that you have to maintain as a good leader. The second thing, just to go right back to the beginning when you talked about the luminous note that you received about your 10-year-old son. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch his name,
His name is Kaijani.
Kai Jani.
Yeah.
Anyway, I once a year, this I promise you this is related. Once a year, I teach a course in intelligence in Spain, and recently, and this is the note I was looking for after the course. Well, I challenge all their course. I get a note from a student who's telling me how thankful he is that I reminded him of how he used to see the world.
Oh,
And it's so beautiful
yeah.
because he got
Yeah.
glasses at the age of 8 or 9 or 10. And before he was diagnosed, he saw the world in a totally different way.
Yeah.
And then got glasses, and now he sees this more linear, specific, precise world. And he
Wow.
was so enamored of being reminded of that that he sent me some drawings he had made as a
Wow.
little kid in his pre-glasses stage. So those are two optimistic things. And then the less optimistic thing I wanted to say is you said that we can all unite around the idea that we want our children to reach their full potential. I have to say that I don't think all parents or all members of a community necessarily agree with that, because if their expression of their individuality is different from the parents' norms or the community's norms, the sad thing we know is true is that they are repressed. And that, of course, causes a type of trauma.
Yeah. No, that's true. I guess I look at it from the standpoint of beneath that all is trauma that can be healed. And back in the day, in the 90s and 2000s, like I'm hip hop generation, grew up on the East Coast. And so I worked on the West Coast with hardcore gangsters in the 90s and 2000s, like real intense kids and real intense violence. It
As
was
a social worker, or what was your job that you were
no,
doing?
no, 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 no. I did carry a caseload for a year and a half of like these amazing kids, of like African American kids, Native American kids, white kids, um, just the whole gamut. But we built programs all in the Pacific Northwest and all over the West Coast. And it was an incredible time in this country where there's some incredible people doing rad, powerful work with young people and in communities like Carl Upchurch and Jeffrey Canada in New York City, who became quite well known for his, I think it was Waiting for Superman program. Um, and these were just forces of nature. So we built these revolutionary programs with a cross section of extraordinary people like surgeons and other doctors and professors and artists and theater people and revolutionaries. We worked with all these 60s era revolutionary groups, that had a history with the intelligence services, let's call that, right? We would often have I would hear the clicking on my phone calls on my landline, and I came to learn what that meant and all that. So that's how heady and amazing our work was. But one thing that I learned is that because we would have these parents, we would bring parents into our work. They had to be present. And I think on the surface, and I think under certain pressures, this is true, that parents, there are there that reality that you just discussed is true. But I can tell you that in all the years of work in with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of families, I can't even remember a single family, a single parent who, when they were in the right circumstance with other parents, that was key, who were all, it wasn't that they had a similar vision of potential, but they built solidarity around the suffering that they all were experiencing by having this expanded distance between themselves and their kids.
Hmm.
Right. And that's what I saw happen over and over again. You had these beautiful children and they were at 9 and they were at 10 and you knew them. Like they were in your heart, they were in your life. And then something happened because reality in our United States reality is so viciously violent for children. And it doesn't really matter where you live, it's just different expressions of violence. And what I saw over and over again is that something happened, something around 9 or 10 or 11, where the parent and the child would lose each other in
Mm,
time and space. And it was the most tragic breaking that you could ever imagine.
mm,
It was so tragic that they didn't even know it had happened, really, right?
mm,
And then when the parents came together with their kids who were now 15, 16, 17, and we had older kids that we had trained, like OGs that were like 18, 19, 20, that we had trained to be facilitators. And we were paying good money, by the way, which is really important to me. It was as if that dimension of time could change, and the yearning in their heart for their 10-year-old back,
mm,
which I totally relate to, right, as a parent, could be transformed into this union of your daughter, who was now 17
mm,
and still wanted to be loved by you as a 10-year-old, right?
mm.
So all that stuff that had gotten in the way of parents and kids and all the madness, I think that sets into parents, that conditioning and programming that just really like messes everything up in this like diabolical, heinous, and awful way. In the right context, with the right energy and the right pressure, because we were like pretty gangster ourselves, it comes back. And I can't tell you how many times, because when I do work like that, I don't always track, because we're just kind of in a different space. It's really heavy, sacred work. So I'm not really remembering stuff all the time afterwards. And I can't tell you how many times I'd be like in a supermarket or something like that, and a parent would come up to me with a level of gratefulness that was very heartwarming. And it was also like, it was always a little stressful because 80% of the time I didn't remember them. And I had such a vivid memory of us and the experience that they had received. But so I would have to kind of play an intelligence game to remember, could get them to tell me what their name was again. And that sometimes overshadowed the meeting. But yeah, so I hear what you're saying, and I have seen in countless examples where time and space can be restored, and all that other stuff can. Now, of course, it takes a willingness and an openness, but mostly it takes people that are doing the work that know how to warrior up and know what they're really up against. If you think it's because the parents are tweaked, that's the wrong perspective, right? It's something has been inflicted upon them, and then you have to have the capability to eliminate it, like kill it, so they can restore that connection with their child, and the child can restore the connection with their parent. Now, I'm not suggesting it's perfect and everyone goes off into Shangri-La, but I tell you that that connection is restored forever. What they do with it then, the yearning for the 10-year-old is now replaced by a real legitimate connection to their 16-year-old. So at least now they have a foundation, they have some ground to stand on to build a future together, which they just absolutely didn't have before. And I think that that's what is happening so much in our communities, and that there's no understanding about how to restore that broken connection.
So, Andrew, I was brought to your tears because your work reminded me of my stepmom Karen's work on the south side of Chicago, working with young adolescents and trying to get the parents to do this reconnection. It's exactly how she would have phrased it. It's quite beautiful. And then I can't help but want to ask you about what happened recently. We're recording this not so far after Charlie Kirk was shot. And I sort of don't dare ask you about that, but also can't help but ask you about that. Just sort of not only the way it was handled in the media I mean, I actually texted my son and said, please don't watch this video, just to warn him. He said, what video? And I said, oh, good, you haven't seen it, don't see it.
Mm.
But I mean, many people didn't have that luxury. Not only how that was handled, but also like, what is it? I mean, I think this is I keep coming back to like we have failed the young men in our country. This is by far the violence is caused by men, and it's largely male on male. Aside from domestic violence, but I'm talking about young men shooters. What, how can we help men, or do you think I'm misdiagnosing this?
I mean, that seems to be the data. And again, it's a great question. And to me, what's really important is that we have to go back in time to come forward in time, right? In order to get our pattern recognition right and our coherency coherent.
You mean like getting that little injection, but what would that mean here?
It would mean that we would have to understand how trauma has been weaponized for 5,000 years as a critical part of empire. And that you can't find an empire that has ever existed that is not, in one shape or form, weaponized trauma, because otherwise you could not have a small group of people rule over millions of people unless the people were conditioned to subjugate themselves. And the most powerful tool to do that is trauma, because trauma fundamentally disrupts that sense of it disrupts us if we use RG theory on three levels. And we see this in
I'm
America,
sorry, what's RG theory?
our renormalization group theory, the
Okay.
way that I spoke to before. So it disrupts us on the micro scale. So we no longer have contact with our bodily sensations. We fail to have introspection. So we have anxiety, we have anger, we have rage, we have all these things, but we have no way of engaging with them. So they possess us,
Mm.
right? Because we're not in relationship to them. The
So they
second,
like almost act out like a demon. Like, what is this thing that's acting out? I don't even know what it is.
oh, when they're being violent.
When you talked about they possess us, that's almost like you're so disassociated from this part of you that it's like, yeah, I had this urge to do it and I did it, but it didn't feel like me.
Yeah, I know that's a really interesting part of it. And so I don't know on that other than the micro scale is disrupted, the meso scale in terms of my ability to interact on a day to day. We see this with all the young men. They have a very impossible way of relating to their own bodies. Most of them are on heavy psychiatric drugs. So this is very problematic, and there's more research being done on this, but that's a big part of this equation here. And I suspect that's doing some very, very awful things to their brains and to their sense of everything. The second is that the day-to-day reality, obviously, as they often express, is completely disrupted. And then most importantly, on the macro scale, their sense of self is distorted as well. So none of those things are connecting. And so they're easily manipulated, easily messed with, easily can receive instructions to act out in violence, whether from themselves, from others, who knows, that deeper question. But it reminds me more mythically. So that's sort of the historical reality that we have to attend to and study, because and I would say this is really important for the intelligence services. Perhaps people know. I talk to the folks that I work with a lot, but we have to understand how trauma is being weaponized right now, not only internal to the country, but external to the country through organized crime. Has become exceedingly good at weaponizing trauma in our communities.
Hey,
And there,
can you drill that down and just, I know, I also want you to keep going, but I also need an example so that it doesn't just sound like words to me.
yeah, so here's how it works. And one could say maybe that's not formally understood, or it is formally understood, or who knows, right? So I moved from Portland, Oregon. This is a classic example. I moved from Portland, Oregon. I went to Portland, Oregon to go to school. And it was a revelation for me to go to school there. I went to Reed College, and it was like I'd never been to a place where people were so consumed by learning. It was going from public school on the East Coast. It was like astonishing. The other thing that I loved about Portland was it was just a basic working class community. And I come from the East Coast, and it's like if it's working class, there's always these class things up, down, the whole, it's huge in New England. It's a really big deal, right? And and I had never been to a place where it wasn't such a big deal. And we were middle of the road politically, not too left, not too right, believed in conserving the environment and sovereignty and economics, basic sensibilities. And then I watched in the 2000s, things started to transition. And the next generation of leaders came in, and they began to be persuaded first by big tech and then by large financial organizations to allow this, what I call sort of foreign investment capital, to come into the city, whether that's through a Google or whether that's through LA real estate people or whatever. And then in front of everyone's eyes, they started to bring in this like smart cities, and they started to bring in this highly expensive real estate. And they did it all in the name of helping everybody for the greater good. And those of us that were at the forefront of working in the city went and met with the mayor and the governor and warned them as much as we could, you do not want to allow foreign investment capital into our community. Because just look at the data, it will destroy our community. And they let it happen. And then it started to slowly erode the community. And once the community got to a certain level of erosion, then you start to finally see the external symptoms because the pattern recognition had not been there. Now you start to see homelessness go from 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 to 5,000 to now it's like at 8,000 people. And then you see the drug switch to where they are now of fentanyl. And then you take away all capability of the police to do anything about it. And then all the businesses leave. And then the downtown becomes this insane place where it's not even like something has just happened there. It's like a form of possession because you have fentanyl and violence and insanity and everyone just like pretending it doesn't exist and the whole city dying from the inside out. And there's a pattern to that. And it's happening to cities all over this country. It's happening to Bozeman. And we are talking to people here because we see the early signs. Foreign investment capital. I don't mean foreign, I just mean outside the community, building expensive real estate that no one's moving into. And no one probably will move into because the capital investors don't need anyone to actually rent the apartments. It's hard for people to grok this reality, but that's what's happening. And you can see it already. And we're
Wait, why
trying,
don't they need anyone to rent the apartments?
well, that's a whole nother question about high finance, how high finance works.
Oh, because they can write it off if they don't.
No, it's
No?
different financial rules and it's just a whole different reality of
Oh,
how finances work, which is critical to understanding what's happening in this country right now and in our communities. But it's like that game plan, and I'm not going to suggest that it's intentional, but it sure has a very similar pattern to it if you take it all the way back to Egypt. And from Egypt to the Persian Empire to the Inquisition to the Americas, it's kind of the same thing. And if we can see it through that lens, that mythical lens, historical lens, then we can apply it to the biological reality that we're all experiencing right now. And that's a long way of saying. So then when a young man who's 22 years old, who senselessly kills a man who has a beautiful wife and two kids, no matter what his political position is, that fundamental disruption has not been put in there. But this is an old game, and it's an old game to fundamentally disrupt our young men, to get them to go out into the world and cause havoc and violence and mayhem. But you can't do it unless you destroy them first, right?
mhm.
There'd be no possibility. Christopher Columbus could not have existed were it not for 5 centuries of torture and devastation of the tribes of Europe through the Inquisition, an literal impossibility. And so Columbus was weaponized, right? And then the native people that I worked with for all these years, they would talk about how when the people came across the ocean and the people asked the native folks, "Who are you?" They said, "We're the human being. Who are you?" Because they didn't recognize them as human beings anymore. And yet they were in flesh and blood. And these were people, these men on the boats that had become insane murderers and killers were once the tribes of Europe. And it's funny because it's hidden in plain sight. What do they say happened in the Inquisition? What was the intention of the people in the Inquisition? We learned this in like eighth grade, to take possession of the souls of the heathens. But you can only do that through a very well-designed, spectacular form of violence and domination. And what's amazing about the tribes of Europe, it took them 5 centuries to relent, right? 4 generations a century. That's 20 generations resisted. And these young men now are totally defenseless. Their tribal identity has been eviscerated. They're white, so they have no real community. The white kids were always the worst off in our work with the kids that were in really high risk situations. All their communities were just devastated in ways that the African American, Latino, and Native communities weren't. Just really different. And so these young white men are just
Interesting.
they're destroyed, and
So
that's what happened to them.
a couple of thoughts. I think we've very interesting, but we left whatever the original question was some time
Yeah.
ago, which is perfectly fine. But just to fill in some background, I'm in Manzanita, Oregon, and I visit every year my friends in Portland. And I've been visiting them for probably 15 years, more than 15 years now. And my friends uh, my friends talk to me about it, and I have witnessed this trauma that Portland has lived through. And as you were talking about it beginning to invade Bozeman, I was thinking of my visit to Walla Walla,
Mm,
where I think you can also see in the very early, lots of new apartment buildings being built in Walla Walla for uh, whatever. So you can kind of see it there. And then when you mentioned this began in Egypt, when I was in Walla Walla, I was talking with good friends, and we always have very serious conversations. We
mm,
also have frivolous conversations, but we were talking about the problem of capital in the world and all of its things that sort of flow from it. And once the Egyptians figured out how to produce excess food for their society, thus you could argue begins the accumulation of capital. And good things happen, but also not so good things happen. And then the final point I want to make, the most recent book I read was, or listened to, was on the history of the East India Company,
mm,
colonized India, and they recruited young unmarried men. The
mhm.
men were in fact forbidden from at least the first 100 years or so from being married because, I mean, and I accept your analysis, they wanted men who would be willing to be brutal. So those are, those are just the thoughts that came into my mind as I was listening to you.
I know Manzanita well. I go there all the time to go
Yeah.
kite surfing, not in the ocean, which I'm sure you
Yeah.
see all the time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful that you live there.
I don't live there, but we have a house. We
Oh,
rent a house every year,
okay, okay,
and
okay.
that's where I am right now.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Andrew and I talk about in terms of our connection and how we work together is that has this wisdom about the past. Like it doesn't occur to me. The question I asked you about Charlie Kirk, it doesn't occur to me to answer that about like historically. And I just think that's so beautiful. I would answer it like psychologically or whatever, but then it's really powerful to think about. I mean, Carmen, I'm sure feels the same way because as an analyst, like knowing a country's history or knowing uh, a region's history would be super crucial to understanding what might happen next. But I feel like you framed that in a way where like suddenly it's almost like the scales are lifted and I go, right, that's what history's for. It's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an intense thing, but I don't know why. I find it quite compelling when you can put the pieces together. And when we get kind of back to it, our original question around healing trauma, I'm working on a book right now. I finished the first draft and then like exploring publishers, but it's called The Labyrinth of Trauma. And the foundational premise that I use is that trauma occurs and heals on three levels simultaneously: the mythical, the historical, and the biological. And so if we superimpose that framework onto just about anything, we get a very rich and coherent way to move and understand. And because we cannot exist in the world as beings without all three. We are mythical beings, we are historical beings, and we are biological beings. In fact, I would put forth that they all are sort of a form of biology. And they're that concrete and rudimentary and foundational to who we are. And so when looking at that young man who killed Charlie Kirk, and then also, Julia, what you're pointing to is then the very predictable and unsavory way in which the media sort of like violates that biblical tenet of like lust of the eye. You know, there are certain things you shouldn't look at because they undermine your soul, you know, I guess on a certain level.
Amen.
Mhm.
So that whole thing, when from an analysis perspective, if we were to take Portland, Bozeman, Walla Walla, organized crime, polarity, divisions, Trump, Biden, COVID, all of it, and frame it and build a map and say, what are the, call them data points, whatever you need to call them, the mythical, historical, and biological data points that we need to give consideration to, that we can now frame within a certain kind of information flow and ask ourselves, where has this flow been disrupted? So, like in trauma, what's primordial, and this is why it's so critical, and we working with folks to try to make this happen, particularly in special operations and in intelligence, the inability to do explicit neurophysiological trauma training during training, pre-deployment, during deployment, post-deployment. Not only do we know has catastrophic outcomes when they leave service, which is demonstratable every day with the amount of suicides and madness, but you have appreciable, easy to study decreases in performance, decreases in pattern recognition that happen at such an imperceptibly small rate, but accumulate. And in those places, perhaps more than Green Army, perhaps more than in civilian life. But when you're talking special operators and intelligence people that need to be at 120% all the time, that 0.05 depreciation in terms of basic skill set is the difference between right analysis, wrong analysis, life or death. And so it's a profound reckoning that I think that the military and intelligence services need to take very seriously, incorporating this, not replacing the training, because it's synthesizing and intensifying and reframing the training to take this very seriously. And so if we have that, then we have this ability to step into the mythical, historical, and biological realms all at once. So I got to imagine if you're trying to understand what's going on in Iran or Iraq or what's happening in Maine with all the organized crime or wherever it is, the fentanyl and the cartels and trafficking, you can't understand these things unless you weave that story together. But in order to hold the energy of it, what you're talking about, Julia, it takes a lot of a nervous system to hold the mythical, historical, and biological together in your being. because it's a big charge. So you
Mhm.
have to move from a 110 volt internal like wiring system to at least a 220.
Mhm.
And if we do that, and we can look at anything that's, I believe, we can look at anything that's going on in this country and get rapid coherency and then know what to do because the seeing directs our action. Because now we can identify the points of activity where we can influence the system. This is the thing, right? That I would say our quote unquote opponents are really good at. Organized crime, whatever you want to call them. High finance and those banking institutions are incredible at this. You just point and nudge one or two little points in the system, and it reorganizes the whole system. You can do that positively to get the amygdala and the neocortex to start working effectively together. So the subsonar is not reading every single thing as a problem.
Mhm.
And you can do that as well with society. Like these young men that are being destroyed, there are solutions to that.
Thank you, Andrew. I kept thinking about how the reason why trauma is such an effective crop to harvest or an effective force to be weaponized is that if you're combining biological, historical, and mythical in one thing in trauma, you basically have meaning. That's meaning. And meaning is not only transgenerational, it's like trans country, it's almost trans, you know, planet. I mean, meaning is its own um, seed of the future. So this is where I start to get into the futurist stuff, which is whatever seeds you're planting with this meaning, with this biological, mythical, and historical background, it's going to grow up into something. And so we're to make the change or poke the influences right at that seed. So, but you don't understand that it's a seed if you don't understand the meaning through time. It's really beautiful.
So one thing you haven't mentioned, Andrew, in this kind of evil brew that our young men live in is the gaming culture, which pops up in so many of these biographies. And you mentioned that wonderful phrase you used about images we shouldn't see. I would love you to repeat it.
Yeah, the lust of the
So,
eye.
say it again.
The lust of the eye.
The lust. Oh my God, that was just amazing. And I don't mean to trivialize it by saying that. But anyway, I don't know if you have any comments to make about where this gaming culture doesn't fit into the stew.
I can only speak from my own personal experience or lack of experience, but like when I've sat down to play, I know this is probably gonna be really controversial for a lot of people, but there's something that happens to my being when I've played a game, even a benign, non-violent game. I've never really played one of those violent games, but just like a surfing game where we were like hanging out between sessions. I definitely notice a certain deadening of my nervous system when that's going on. And that's just like trying to get Kelly Slater to do a quadruple flip off the lip kind of thing. Um, there's something to me that is really dangerous, and maybe even call it diabolical, about the way that the games create a repetitive normalization of violence. And I know people have talked about this and they talk about it a lot, but I'm not sure they understand what is actually happening.
Yeah.
And someone down in Silicon Valley once asked me, what percentage of neuroscientists actually work in the field of neuroscience, like for the general public good? And I'm like, I don't know, like 95%. They're like, no, it's just the opposite.
It's like
95,
five.
yeah,
Yeah.
95% work here in Silicon Valley to like create this machine. And I was like, wow, there's going to be a long line in trying to explain my behavior at the gate with Peter, you know? It's like, okay, so you're a neuroscientist and you did what with your talents? Okay, right? But I think that there is obviously a lot of skill going into those games in terms of generating a particular outcome, in terms of, Julia, what you're saying, to disrupt meaning making to such a fundamental degree. You can't get those young men to serve the East Indian country. You can't get a
Company.
Columbus. What?
The East India Company.
East India Company.
Yeah,
You
so
can't,
just yet again, right into your capital point about capital. So the
yeah.
colonial wedge, the wedge of the British Empire was actually a capital
Hmm.
intensive company.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And so everything has that. It has that component where we're disrupting our mental perceptive capability. And you can do that through repetitive exposure to trauma.
Which includes porn, by the way, is trauma inducing.
And I mean, I just generally the streaming culture. It's one of the things that just drives me nuts about social interaction these days is almost always one of the first questions someone asks you is, what are you watching? As if this was the purpose of my life. I am highly annoyed by it.
You
You
should
got
just answer like I worked at the CIA for 30 years. I'm watching you.
No, no,
I know
no.
you should. Well, here in Montana, they'd be like, "Well, I'm not watching anything because I just came off like a week-long bow hunting trip for
Yeah, well,
mountain
see,
goats," right?
yeah.
But I think in the cities, yeah, it's sort of that way. But now all of this is symptomatic. I mean, we can talk about all the symptoms and they're talked about, and people make a hefty living off it, analyzing the heck out of all this stuff. But what seems to me systematically missing is the conversation that gets to the foundation, right? If we want to stop the flooding, like you're not going to say, okay, we're going to divert the flow of the Brahmaputra by the time it gets to Bangladesh. No, you're going to go to the source of the Brahmaputra and you're going, no, that's not, is that the right name of that river?
I don't
I
know.
don't know. I was trusting
Anyway,
you on this.
yeah, I think that's the name, but I'm probably wrong. And you're going to go to the source where you can gently and easily redirect it back to its flow, right? So with all these problems, quote unquote, in society, our problem is not the problems. The challenge that we face is that we lack a certain coherency in our analysis. And we're starting in the wrong place.
I
And
agree.
that's,
I have to say, I agree with you completely. I might not, we might disagree as to where the right place is or what, whatever, but that the basic thing is what you just said. I am totally in agreement with you.
well, the
Not that it
beautiful thing
matters a
about,
lot, but
I
well, the
am
beautiful thing
too.
you're
Yeah.
saying, no, it does matter, is that when we're seeking the source, we don't have to agree on where to start. That's the incredible thing. Our
that's right.
inquiry is not about who's right and who's wrong,
Yes.
right? It's about Carmen, what do you see?
Yes.
What do you see? Because one of the things that we do when we're working, particularly with like senior executives, we have one thing that we do that sort of that we ask people to not do. This one thing. And that is we ask people to engage in this practice where for as much time as we need you to do, we will not enter into a conversation using I feel or I think.
Hmm.
We will enter into all of our conversations together using I see. And we tell them if you're a parent, I challenge you to do this for the next week. Just enter into conversations with your child saying, I see. And we explain to them that two things will happen. One, you're actually going to start to activate a very different muscle in your being. The muscle of I think and I feel is a really different muscle than the muscle of I see. The second thing is we can sit in a room with 10 people and try to ask, what is the source of this 22-year-old going on a murderous spree? And if someone says, well, I feel this is happening, conversation over. Someone
Right.
says, I think this is happening, conversation over. Because now we have to defend a position, which is which is a lack of training. That's all it is. It's an ineffective way to get to the bottom of something. So instead, Julia, what do you see? Carmen, what do you see? What do I see? Then I don't have to defend what I'm seeing. I see this leg of the elephant. You see the trunk. You see it this way. And we literally can begin to put the Legos together and then turn it and move it and take pieces apart. And then when we're all seeing, this is, I think, revelatory. And David Bohm discovered this as a physicist.
Yes.
Right?
Mhm.
Really important, right? I don't know if I got it from him, but some anthropologist that he was working with or read a story about was going into some tribal reality in which all the people of the tribe would come together and they would all share all their problems with their neighbor and with this and with everything else. And the anthropologist was struck by the fact that like the elder didn't solve anything. They didn't have them come to agreement and shake hands and all this stuff and come up with solutions. And then everyone would leave the meeting. And then somehow, miraculously, everyone in that community got along really well. And so for Bohm, it was solutions was actually not the thing that led to the coherency of the people. It was the shared meaning that led to the coherency, which is a fundamental disruption of this entire way in which we think we're supposed to analyze to get to solutions, when instead what we're trying to do is use our analysis to build shared understanding, not in some soft woo-woo way, but in a way that is the most concrete way to influence the future, right?
I'm so
Yep.
excited about that statement.
But we
That
don't
is
have to be,
correct.
so Kari, we don't have to be right. If we want to,
No.
if it's about you being right and me being wrong, or you being kind of right and me being kind of wrong, then we're already like, we should go and just start playing video games, right? Because we're not in the right
Right.
geographical space to be effective, and we're not going to be responsible to our kids if we're doing that.
Argumentation is not the path. It's the wrong path.
It is the wrong path.
Yeah, yeah. I love this. So people, when they talk about how what they see, then they are listened to, they are heard. And when people feel heard, that's enough. You don't have to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Something happens to us neurophysiologically,
Yeah,
cosmically, physically, historically. Our mythical traditions is what's so misunderstood. Like we read these texts like they're literal things.
yeah.
They're teaching stories. They're designed to set a pattern of health and well-being in the next generation. So you under
Wait. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because we only have a few more minutes and I gotta ask you this question
Mhm.
about myths. If you could have people understand or hear of any particular myths, because I know you're a myth junkie, you're very knowledgeable about myths, I should say it that way. Um, and we only have a few more minutes, like we have 2 minutes, let's say. What myth would you say is best to understand where we're at right now as a society in the United States?
I wouldn't say it's one particular myth, but I would say there's a certain technology of myth that's crucial right now, that it's the technology of descent,
Mm.
in which the hero, whether it's Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, or it's Beowulf in the swamp, or it's Inanna in the underworld, there's something about the descent. The Greek had a word for it, atakbaskis, or something along the lines of that, where and Joseph Campbell sort of kind of screwed it up, but kind of was looking at it at least to some degree. The descent is primordial in our mythical traditions.
Right.
And what's important about the mythical context is what the stories teach us is that in that landscape of descent, the signs and symbols are so different that there's nothing in this ascent world that can help us to navigate that world, but we must go into that world, not to come out with the elixir in some kind of heroic lunacy journey. Like,
Yeah.
forget the hero. I don't care about heroes. We're enough with the heroes, right? But what's not about heroism at all It's about somehow in there is capacity that connects us to something that you're talking about, Julia, that intimately connects us to the past and to the future all at once and equips us to deal with the real dangers and opportunities of this world. And nothing else will do it. Nothing else will do it. And so there's an analysis that happens in the descent, and there's an analysis that happens in the ascent. And the signs and symbols and orientation have nothing whatsoever to do with each other than the fact that they are needed both.
Right.
And so when we look at the Bhagavad Gita, our temptation is to study everything after Arjuna's collapse in the battlefield. But the most important thing in the book are the pages that lead up to his descent, his collapse. And here we are as this great nation, and we are in a state of complete collapse. And we can fight that, and we can try to solve for that, or we can go in. And in there, we will find everything that we need, but we're going to have to train for that.
Yeah.
Because most people that do the descent, we only hear in the mythical stories the ones that survive. 95% don't survive or go crazy or both. And so we're dying
Cassandra.
and going crazy all at once, right?
Exactly.
But we can avoid that
Hmm.
fate by training and understanding and seeing coherently, right?
I'm so glad I asked that question. Thank you.
That's awesome.
All
Yeah,
right, Andrew,
this has been great.
this is amazing.
Awesome. Awesome and a half.
Yeah, awesome and a half. I think
Awesome .5.